Did you ever come across like the philosophy angle of logic? So if you think about the 80s with AI, the expert systems where you try to
Yeah.
kind of uh, maybe sidestep the poetry of language and some of the syntax and the grammar and all that kind of stuff and go to the underlying meaning that language is trying to communicate and try to somehow compress that in a computer representable way. Did you ever come across that in your studies?
I mean, I probably did, but I wasn't as interested in it. I was trying to do the easier problems first, the ones I could
Yeah.
thought maybe were handleable, which seems like the syntax is easier, like which is just the forms as opposed to the meaning. Like you're talking about when you're starting talking about the meaning, that's a very hard problem, and it still is a really really hard problem.
Mhm.
But the forms is easier, and so I thought at least figuring out the forms of human language, which sounds really hard, but is actually maybe more tractable.
So it's interesting. You think there is a big divide, there's a gap, there's a distance between form and meaning. Because that's a question you have discussed a lot with LLMs
Hmm.
because they're damn good at form.
Yeah, I think that's what they're good at is
Y-
form.
Yeah.
Exactly, and that's why they're good because they can do form. Meaning's hard.
Do you think there's, oh, wow. And I mean, it's an open question, right?
Yeah,
How close form and meaning are.
yeah,
But we'll discuss it.
yeah.
But to me, studying form, maybe it's a romantic notion,
Mhm.
gives you form is like the shadow of the bigger meaning thing underlying language. As form language is how we communicate ideas. We communicate with each other using language. So in understanding the structure of that communication, I think you start to understand the structure of thought and the structure of meaning behind those thoughts and communication to me. But to you, big gap.
Yeah.
What do you find most beautiful about human language? Maybe the form of human language, the expression of human language.
What I find beautiful about human language is the some of the generalizations
Mhm.
that happen across the human languages within and across a language. So let me give you an example of something which I find kind of remarkable. That is, if like a language, if it has a word order such that the verbs tend to come before their objects, and so that's like English does that. So we have the subject comes first in a simple sentence. So I say, the dog chased the cat, or Mary kicked the ball. So the subject's first, and then after the subject, there's the verb, and then we have objects. All these things come after in English. So it's generally a verb, and most of the stuff that we want to say comes after the subject. It's the objects. There's a lot of things we want to say that come after, and there's a lot of languages like that. About 40% of the languages of the world are look like that. They're subject verb object languages, and then these languages tend to have prepositions, these little markers on the nouns that connect nouns to other nouns or nouns to verbs. So a verb like a preposition like in or on or of or about. I say I talk about something. The something is the object of that preposition. That we have these little markers come also just like verbs. They come before their nouns. Okay, and then so now we look at other languages that like Japanese or Hindi or these are so-called verb final languages. Those is about maybe a little more than 40%, maybe 45% of the world's languages or more. I mean, 50% of the world's languages are verb final. Those tend to be um, postpositions. Those markers, they have the same kinds of markers as we do in English, but they put them after. So, they put them first. The markers come first. So you say instead of um, talk about a book, you say a book about, the opposite order there in Japanese or in Hindi. You do the opposite, and the talk comes at the end. So the verb will come at the end as well. So instead of Mary kicked the ball, it's Mary ball kicked. And then if it's Mary kicked the ball to John, it's John to. The marker there, the preposition, it's a postposition in these languages. And so the interesting thing, a fascinating thing to me, is that within a language, this order aligns. It's harmonic. And so if it's one or the other, if it's either verb initial or verb final, but then you'll have prepositions, prepositions, or postpositions, and that's across the languages that we can look at.
Mhm.
We've got around 1,000 languages for there's around 7,000 languages around on the earth right now, but we have information about, say, word order on around 1,000 of those, pretty decent amount of information. And for those 1,000 which we know about 95% fit that pattern. So they will have either verb, it's about half and half, or half are verb initial, like English, and half are verb final, like Japanese.
So just to clarify, verb initial is subject, verb, object.
That's correct.
Verb final is still subject, object, verb.
That's correct. Yeah, the subject is generally first.
That's so fascinating. I ate an apple, or I apple ate.
Yes.
Okay. And it's fascinating that there's a pretty even division in the world amongst those 45%.
Yeah, it's pretty even. And those two are the most common by far. Those two word orders, the subject tends to be first. There's so many interesting things, but these things are, the thing I find so fascinating is there are these generalizations within and across a language. And not only those are and there's actually a simple explanation, I think, for a lot of that. And that is you're trying to like minimize dependencies between words. That's basically the story, I think, behind a lot of why word order looks the way it is we're always connecting. I mean, what is the thing I'm telling you? I'm talking to you in sentences. You're talking to me in sentences. These are sequences of words which are connected, and the connections are dependencies between the words. And it turns out that what we're trying to do in a language is actually minimize those dependency links. It's easier for me to say things if the words that are connecting for their meaning are close together. It's easier for you in understanding if that's also true. If they're far away, it's hard to produce that, and it's hard for you to understand. And the languages of the world, within a language and across languages, fit that generalization, which is, so it turns out that having verbs initial and then having prepositions ends up making dependencies shorter, and having verbs final and having postpositions ends up making dependencies shorter than if you cross them. If you cross them, you just end up, it's possible. You can do it.
You mean within a language?
Within a language, you can do it. It just ends up with longer dependencies than if you didn't. And so languages tend to go that way. They tend to they call it harmonic. So it was observed a long time ago by without the explanation by a guy called Joseph Greenberg, who's a famous typologist from Stanford. He observes a lot of generalizations about how word order works, and these are some of the harmonic generalizations that he observed.